What this presentation is about is how to decide where to start when you're new to programming. There's a lot of options out there. You're probably used to hearing about JavaScript and Ruby and other languages from different people, and they can be a little bit intimidating when you're first getting into coding because there's not especially if you don't have a mentor to be able to tell you what's good about language choice X or Y. So here's an agenda of some of the things we'll cover today. You've probably heard the terms a lot, front end versus back end, and you've probably also heard about some things that are languages and other things that are frameworks. We'll talk about the difference between both of those, and we'll talk about the best way to go about learning one versus the other. We'll talk about some good ideas and bad ideas for places to start. Then we'll go into a decision tree that is meant to just show you, given your situation, what might be the best choice for you. And guys, I apologize for the technical difficulties here. I think I'm going to use a different tool next time, or at least get to know this one a little bit better. It's bothering me that I can't hear any of you guys. It's not that big of a room, so it'd be nice to just be able to speak. If anyone knows how to use Google On-Air Hangout and knows how to enable audio for everyone, please shoot me a message and I'll just open it up, because we've got less than 20 people in the room, so it should be manageable. Okay, diving right into it. There's a lot of options. You've probably seen a lot of these languages, different places. You might have friends that have mentioned one or the other, or you've read about on the internet. The easiest way to start breaking these down into a more manageable way to think about them are the terms backend and front end. Most applications these days, whether it's an app on your phone or it's something that you use in a browser, it's going to have a front-end component that's usually written in JavaScript, JavaScript with a blend of HTML and CSS if it's in your browser. If it's on your phone, it might be written in iOS, in Objective-C, or in Android's framework on Java. All of these front-end layers interact typically with a back-end layer, and on that back-end side, you have a database, which might be something like MySQL or MongoDB, and then you're going to have this API layer, which talks to the database and also talks back to your respective front end. And common languages you see for that service layer are Ruby, PHP, Python, Java, etc. So this is just to give you an idea of what some popular websites use for different parts to actually run. You'll notice the commonality is that almost everything uses JavaScript on the front end. When it comes to the back end, there's a variety. Most of these websites are they have a huge amount of users, so there's a little bit of a bias toward languages that do really well with a lot of traffic. So we see a lot of Java here. We see some languages like C and C++ in places even. You hear about, around here especially, you hear about Ruby a lot, Ruby on Rails. What's interesting is you don't see that as much on these really heavily trafficked websites. It's a really good language for rapidly developing something. But some companies have found Twitter is a good example where they originally built their application in Rails and they faced some scaling challenges and ended up moving to something different. So some general tips for learning a language. The most important thing is to just keep in mind that there's commonalities between every language. And once you learn the basics, once you learn what an if-else is and how to do loops and concepts like object-oriented programming, those are going to carry over into pretty much every other language you learn. Finding a mentor is really helpful. If you have someone that you can reach out to and ask for help. Another common mistake I've seen a lot of people make is that they're just learning to code and then they'll try to learn more than one thing at once. They might be a lot of classes that teach intro web programming. They'll teach something like Ruby on Rails, but then they also mix in a little bit of JavaScript and something else. It's not a good way to start out. You're best to start out with one language, master it, and then move on. You want to plan to spend a lot of time learning your first language, especially. It's a big time commitment. It's not something you can easily pick up from just an hour this week, an hour the next week. You want to really be able to carve out some time in your schedule to really learn it. Work in a domain that's interesting to you. That's something I often have advised my friends that are learning to program. If you're really into sports, then you might try learning in the frame of building an application that pulls sports data from an API. And the project you want to work on can seem daunting at first, but you can break it down into manageable milestones. Like, you're not going to try to, if you're building a sports app, you don't want to try to build the whole thing in your first week, but you might try to make one of the API calls you need 1 week and another one the next week. And before you know it, you're starting to put these pieces together, and eventually you've built something really cool. So this is a major point of confusion when people are starting out. Ruby on Rails gets thrown out a lot. And what's confusing about Ruby on Rails in particular, and it's the same situation with JavaScript and some other frameworks like Angular, is that Ruby is a language. It's a pure programming language that you can do things with independently. But Ruby on Rails is an entire framework that it's built in Ruby, and it allows you to do a lot of things with Ruby code. But learning the two together, if you've never programmed at all, it's like learning two not completely related things at the same time. It's almost like you're trying to learn, you only speak English, but you're trying to learn French from an instructor that speaks German. So I would advise all of you to initially just focus on learning a language, and then once you're comfortable with that language, to move on to a framework. Same situation with JavaScript. There's a lot of JavaScript frameworks. Angular and React are two of the most popular ones. But again, the best approach is if you started with JavaScript, is that you want to just isolate JavaScript first and then move on to this framework. All right, so next I'm going to talk about some good choices and bad choices for first starting languages. So, like I said, one bad place to start is a framework. Start with the language first. A lot of people I'll ask, they'll tell me they're learning to code, and I'll ask, okay, well, what language are you learning? And they'll respond with, well, I'm learning HTML. So that's also not a good place to start, because HTML is not a programming language. It's a markup. It's used by programming languages, but you're not going to learn programming by starting with HTML or CSS. Some other ones that I listed that aren't great ideas. SQL is not a great idea. That's very domain focused. Java, C, and C++, Objective-C. These are great languages. They're very popular languages and used a ton of places. But the main reason I don't recommend them for people to start with is that there's a lot of boilerplate work involved. You want to be able to get to using the concept of the language and building things, but a lot of these languages have barriers. They're very verbose, and sometimes for good reasons. But there's a lot of extra stuff that you need to learn just to get started. So that's why I don't recommend starting with those when you're just trying to learn the fundamentals of coding. They're better to learn as a second language, for example. So some good places to start. The best two are really Ruby and Python. Ruby and Python are very similar languages. They're very powerful languages. You can do a lot with them. There are APIs and libraries just for pretty much anything you can think of. There's a API out there that you can use with Ruby or Python, and you can do really interesting things. Pretty much anything, even all the way down to there are ways to build mobile applications using Ruby code, because you can cross-compile your Ruby code into iOS code. So those are the best two to start. They're very low boilerplate. The language reads very naturally. So those are usually the two I recommend. I usually recommend that someone starts with one of those two. As for which one, that depends. I think the biggest factor that depends on is if you have a mentor, and if one of your good friends knows Python, then your friend's going to be a lot more helpful if you're learning Python than if you were trying to learn Ruby. So I think that's the biggest consideration. There's almost a religious war between the two. I happen to prefer Ruby a little bit more, but they're both great choices. As I'll show on the next slide, I do recommend JavaScript in some situations. Same goes for Swift. So here's the big slide. How do you actually figure this out? And I will be sharing this deck, and I'll especially this image after the event, so don't worry, you don't have to screenshot it, but also feel free to. Show this in a bigger version. I also apologize, this is not in a good presentation mode. I had some screen sharing issues here. Presentations are not my specialty. Coding is more so my specialty. So like I mentioned and alluded to on the last slide, most paths for a first language that I'd recommend lead to Ruby or Python. Just like I said, if you have a mentor that prefers one or the other, I'd recommend taking their advice. I do recommend JavaScript if you are a web designer, or you know that you're interested in doing front-end web development for one reason or another. Maybe you've always gone graphic design and you want to start adding interactivity to it, that is a good justification for starting with JavaScript. The reason I don't normally recommend JavaScript is that it doesn't have as much power, and it's not as organized as into an object-oriented language like Ruby or Python. So starting out with JavaScript can kind of teach a new coder some bad practices, whereas Python or Ruby give you a really solid grounding in the right fundamentals, and it's easy to move on to JavaScript from there. A couple resources. Codecademy, they have that's probably my most commonly recommended one outside of my own. They have a lot of free lessons online, and they offer many languages now, including Ruby and Python and JavaScript, and they're interactive. Really, the only downside with those is that I've seen a lot of times where people they'll make a lot of initial progress, but then they'll get stuck. And there's online communities to ask questions, but it slows people down sometimes if they don't just have someone to go ask. Replit is a tool that I use in all the courses that I teach, especially the entry-level ones. It has an in-browser language emulator, so it can basically take away a lot of some of those initial challenges when you're first starting out. Even just setting up your computer for whatever development environment you want to use can be a challenge in its own right. So using one of these when you're learning the real basics, what is an if-else statement, etc., can be a good way to start out. The course I offer is through First Step Coding. We have a 2-week course that starts next week. I'll share a bit more information about that to anyone that's interested. But it's I think it's a great way to learn because it's a small group, and it's much less of a commitment than something like a boot camp or General Assembly. It's less of a commitment in the financial sense, but also in the sense that the classes are offered at night in a 2-week increment, so you can try it out for 2 weeks and see if you like it, and if you like it, keep doing it. If not, you can try something else. I'll send out that link and more information in the follow-up too. This is a point where I wanted to open it up entirely to your questions. I haven't seen any in the sidebar yet. If you scroll to the left, you should see a hover menu, and there should be a little blue widget that says Q&A. Should be enabled, so feel free to ask. I'm going to search one more time for if there's an easy way to just enable audio, because that would make this much simpler than using a widget. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing it. So I will do another one of these soon, and we'll have another forum, and maybe just skip into doing questions so we can get some more interactivity. I apologize for the technical difficulties today, and thanks for hanging in there. You guys did. And feel free to write me in the meantime. Write me directly, either just on the meetup if you have some particular questions, and I can follow up over message, or feel free to shoot me a note at Andy@firststepcoding.com. And yeah, thanks again for coming, guys. We'll definitely get these technical issues sorted out for next time. But that's all I have. Okay, I do see a question coming up now. If I develop IoT projects, what type of backend APIs might I want to be familiar with? There are some IoT frameworks being built specifically for that purpose. There's one, I haven't used any of them yet, but there's one that Amazon is developing. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, so it's called AWS IoT. Let me see if I can paste that in here. Yeah, if you just Google for AWS IoT, that's a new framework that's out there. There's also a lot of just publish, subscribe type APIs out there, so that would be something else to look for. But if you're thinking about doing that stuff and you haven't done any coding yet at all, I'd recommend, to my comment about the frameworks, I'd recommend you get really comfortable with just regular coding first before trying to jump into any of those. All right, guys, I'm not seeing any other questions yet, so I'm going to end the broadcast here, and thanks again.